In the 19th century, being insane didn't mean hearing voices. It meant reading novels, arguing about politics, being too happy, too sad, or just uncomfortable. These are 44 real reasons people were legally locked in asylums. Not criminals, not monsters, just ordinary people. One wrong trait, one bad day, and your life was over. 1. Novel reading was somehow considered a valid reason to lock someone up and throw away the key. Imagine sitting in your parlor enjoying a nice story about knights and dragons, and suddenly the sheriff busts in to drag you to the asylum because you looked too happy. The doctors claimed that reading fiction broke your brain and made you unable to function in the real world. It is the most hilarious logic imaginable because they basically criminalized imagination. You were not allowed to have fun with a book, or you would be labeled novel-crazed and forced to stare at a blank wall until you promised to be boring again. 2. Politics was literally listed as a mental illness in West Virginia asylum ledgers, and it is absolutely hysterical. If you walked into a tavern and had a strong opinion about who should be the next governor, you were playing a dangerous game with your freedom. The medical geniuses of the time decided that caring about the government was a sign that your mind had completely snapped. You could be a totally normal guy, but if you shouted once during a debate about taxes, you were diagnosed with political excitement and carted off. It seems the only way to stay sane in the 19th century was to have absolutely no thoughts in your head whatsoever. 3. Laziness was actually a diagnosable medical condition that could get you institutionalized for years. You heard that right. If you just didn't feel like working on the farm one day, your family could sign papers claiming you were mentally deranged. Doctors called it constitutional laziness and treated it like a severe brain infection that required isolation. It is the ultimate dream for anyone who hates their job, except instead of a vacation, you got a cold cell and terrible food. It is mind-blowing that they couldn't tell the difference between a guy who just wanted a nap and a guy who actually needed psychiatric help. 4. Religious enthusiasm is the most trap card diagnosis in history because you were punished for doing exactly what you were told to do. Everyone was expected to go to church, but if you sang the hymns a little too loud or looked too excited about heaven, you were done for. The doctors claimed that thinking about the afterlife too hard would burn out your brain circuits like a candle. It is pure comedy that you had to be religious to be a good citizen. But if you actually acted like you believed it, they put you in a straitjacket. You practically had to measure your prayers with a ruler to make sure you weren't acting crazy. 5. Bad whiskey was a specific and separate reason for admission that filled up asylum wards faster than anything else. We are not talking about alcoholism. We are talking about the quality of the drink itself being blamed for instant insanity. Doctors believed that cheap, homemade liquor contained special poisons that instantly turned a gentleman into a lunatic after one glass. Instead of just admitting the guy was drunk and needed to sleep it off, they declared him legally insane and locked him up. It is hilarious to think that if you bought the expensive stuff, you were fine. But if you bought the cheap stuff, you were obviously trying to destroy your own mind. 6. Tobacco use was listed as a primary cause of insanity, and it makes you wonder if anyone in the 19th century was actually safe. The doctors looked at a guy smoking a pipe and genuinely concluded that the smoke was traveling up his nose and drying out his brain like a piece of beef jerky. It is absolutely hysterical that they thought nicotine was a hallucinogen that turned respectable men into raving maniacs. If you enjoyed a cigar after dinner, your family could technically call the authorities and claim you were suffering from tobacco madness. It is a miracle that any tobacco plantation owners weren't locked up in their own basements. 7. Hard study was a legitimate medical diagnosis that proves education was considered a dangerous weapon against your own sanity. If a student spent too many hours reading textbooks or trying to solve math problems, the doctor would say his brain engine had overheated from overuse. It is the ultimate excuse for every lazy student in history because you could literally get institutionalized for doing your homework too well. Parents were terrified that if their kid learned too much, he would snap and end up in the asylum. Basically, being smart was treated like a risky extreme sport that could land you in a padded cell. 8. Egotism is arguably the funniest reason for admission because they essentially criminalized having a big ego. If you walked around town thinking you were the smartest or best-looking guy in the room, That was not just a personality flaw, it was a medical emergency. The asylum ledgers are full of people whose only crime was loving themselves way too much. Doctors believed that intense vanity was a sign that the brain had lost its grip on reality. It is wild to think that if you bragged a little too hard about your new horse, you could spend the next 10 years staring at a stone wall. 9. Jealousy was not just a relationship problem back then. It was a diagnosable brain disease that required immediate lockup. If a husband got suspicious of his wife or a woman got mad at her partner for looking at someone else, the medical solution was the asylum. They didn't have marriage counseling, they had straitjackets. It is completely absurd that a common human emotion was treated like a virus that needed to be quarantined. You could be totally normal, but one big argument about who your spouse was talking to at the market, and suddenly you are legally certified as insane by the state. 10. Worms is perhaps the most disgusting and laughable diagnosis on the entire list of asylum admissions. We are talking about physical parasites here, but 19th century doctors were dead serious that having worms in your system caused insanity. They believed the parasites released toxins that traveled up the spine and poisoned the brain, turning a normal person into a raving lunatic. So, if a guy had a stomach bug and acted a little irritable, they didn't just give him medicine to kill the parasites, they declared him legally insane. It is mind-blowing stupidity that a physical hygiene problem was treated with psychiatric imprisonment. You could be locked up for years simply because you drank some dirty water and needed a doctor who actually knew what he was doing. 11. Bad company appears as a formal cause for admission in asylum ledgers, and it is basically the ultimate strict parent move. If a young man started hanging out with a rough crowd or drinking at the wrong tavern, his family could claim his brain had been infected by his friends. The doctors agreed that poor social choices were a symptom of deep mental instability. It is absolutely wild that they treated peer pressure like a medical emergency. You could be perfectly sane, but because your buddy Steve was a bad influence, you ended up in a straitjacket. It is the most extreme way to force someone to get new friends in history. 12. Superstition was a one-way ticket to the asylum, which is hilarious because almost everyone back then believed in ghosts. But if you took it a step too far and refused to walk under a ladder or panicked about a black cat, the doctor would sign the papers. They claimed that believing in bad omens paralyzed the brain's rational functions. It is pure comedy that, in an era where they used leeches for medicine, they locked people up for believing in magic. You literally had to be superstitious in the correct way, or you were labeled a lunatic and dragged away from society. 13. Disappointed love was a massive category for admission, and it means exactly what you think it means. If you got dumped by your sweetheart and spent too much time crying in your room, it was not just heartbreak, it was insanity. Doctors believed that the shock of romantic rejection could permanently shatter the mind. It is so stupid that they treated a normal breakup like a terminal illness. Instead of eating ice cream and moving on, you were thrown into a cell to think about your ex-partner forever. It was basically illegal to be sad about being single in the 19th century. 14. Sunstroke was frequently listed as a cause of insanity, and it shows how confused medical science really was. If you worked in the fields too long and got dizzy from the heat, they didn't just give you water and shade. They decided the sun had boiled your brain and turned you into a maniac. It is baffling that a physical issue like dehydration was treated with psychiatric confinement. You could wake up with a bad headache from a hot day and end up locked away for years because the doctor thought the sunbeams had erased your personality. 15. Self-abuse was the polite Victorian code word used to lock up thousands of confused young men for absolutely no good reason. The most respected medical textbooks claimed that this private habit would literally drain the spinal fluid out of your back and turn your brain into mush. Parents were terrified that their sons were melting their own minds, so they watched them like hawks for any sign of fatigue. If a boy looked a little too pale at the breakfast table, he was assumed to be crazy and shipped off to the institution. It is the most baffling biological theory ever invented, treating a natural impulse like a contagious virus that required metal restraints and cold showers to cure. 16. Indigestion appears frequently in asylum records, and it is honestly the most terrifyingly stupid reason to lose your freedom in history. Doctors in the 19th century were fully convinced that a stomach ache was a direct highway to total mental collapse because they believed the gut and the brain were practically the same organ. If you ate a piece of bad pork or had too much cheese before bed and started groaning in pain, your family wouldn't just give you some water. They would call the authorities to haul you away. Imagine eating a spicy meal and regretting it, only to find yourself strapped to a bed in a stone cell because the local medical genius decided your heartburn was actually a sign of incurable madness. It is absolute comedy that they treated a simple tummy ache with solitary confinement instead of just letting you burp and take a nap. 17. Spiritualism was a wildly popular hobby where people tried to talk to ghosts, but it was also a guaranteed way to get yourself committed to the madhouse. The medical establishment decided that if you believed in spirits or went to a seance to knock on tables, your brain had obviously turned to mush. It is the ultimate hypocrisy because society was obsessed with the supernatural. Yet, if you actually claimed to hear a ghost, you were labeled a danger to the public. You could be a perfectly functional person, but the moment you bought a Ouija board or attended a spooky party, doctors would sign the admission papers. They basically criminalized being a goth kid 100 years before it was cool, treating a belief in the afterlife as a severe neurological disease that required bars on the windows. 18. Domestic trouble is a diagnosis that appears over and over again, and it basically means that having an argument with your spouse was illegal. If a husband and wife yelled at each other too loudly or often, the neighbors or the doctor could intervene and decide that one of them, usually the one losing the argument, was mentally unstable. Instead of marriage counseling or just taking a walk to cool off, the solution was to lock someone up in an asylum for months. It is hilarious to think that the stress of a bad relationship was treated like a contagious virus. You could be totally sane, but because your partner was annoying you and you shouted about it, you ended up eating gruel in a straitjacket while your spouse enjoyed the quiet house alone. 19. Loss of property was a legitimate medical reason for admission that proves being broke was considered a mental illness. If a man made a bad investment or lost his farm in a gambling game, the sheer shock of losing his money was viewed as a brain injury. Doctors believed that the human mind could not handle financial ruin without snapping, so they locked up bankrupt people alongside legitimate maniacs. It is the most backward logic imaginable, because instead of helping you get back on your feet, they threw you in a prison for crazy people. You literally lost your house and your money, and the government's response was to take away your freedom too, just in case you felt sad about being poor. 20. Greediness appears in the records, and it is just spectacular that wanting money was proof of madness. If a businessman worked too hard to make a profit or refused to share his wealth, the community could label him as suffering from acquisitiveness and have him committed. The doctors decided that wanting to be rich was an unnatural state of mind that proved your brain was broken. It is the most ironic thing ever because the asylum charged fees to keep you there. But if you focused too much on earning the money to pay them, you were the crazy one. You literally had to pretend you didn't care about cash just to stay free. 21. Excessive joy is honestly the most depressing reason to be locked up, because it essentially made happiness illegal in the 19th century. If you received good news or just had a really great day and couldn't stop smiling, the doctors would look at you with deep suspicion. They believed that the human brain was designed for misery and hard work, so any display of extreme happiness was a sign of mania that needed to be crushed immediately. Imagine winning a contest or hearing a funny joke, and your reward is a one-way trip to a padded cell because you laughed too hard in public. It is absolutely wild that they treated a good mood like a dangerous overdose of emotions. You basically had to walk around with a frown just to prove to your neighbors that you were mentally stable and not suffering from a fatal case of joy. 22. Kicked in the head by a horse appears in the records, and it highlights the total lack of distinction between brain damage and insanity back then. If you were unlucky enough to stand behind a moody stallion and got clobbered, you didn't get surgery or ice packs, you got a straitjacket. The doctor saw a guy stumbling around, slurring his words and acting dizzy after a massive blow to the skull, and instead of treating the concussion, they declared him a lunatic. It is the most unfair medical diagnosis ever because You are literally the victim of an animal attack, and your punishment is life imprisonment with people who talk to walls. It proves that if your head hurt for any reason, they just assumed your mind was gone forever and gave up on you. 23. Seduction was a diagnosable mental illness that was essentially the ultimate form of victim blaming for young women. If a girl was charmed by a smooth-talking guy and made a few bad decisions, her parents wouldn't just ground her or scold her. They would sign papers claiming that her moral compass had been shattered, leading to immediate insanity. The medical logic was that no sane woman would ever fall for a bad boy, so if she did, her brain must be broken. It is absurdly hilarious that they treated a romantic mistake like a neurological disorder. Instead of learning a life lesson about dating, these women were locked away in asylums to recover from the trauma of having a boyfriend their dad didn't like. 24. Sleeping on feather beds sounds like a joke, but there were genuine medical theories that soft bedding caused madness. Some doctors believed that the heat generated by goose feathers would travel up the spine and cook the brain while you slept, leading to soft-headedness and insanity. It is the most ridiculous pseudoscience imaginable, because they were basically telling people that being comfortable was dangerous. If you woke up groggy after a good night's sleep in a soft bed, they might accuse you of frying your own mind with luxury. You were practically required to sleep on a sack of rocks just to ensure your brain stayed hard and rational, proving that the Victorians hated comfort almost as much as they hated happiness. 25. Medicine is an ironic cause for admission because it means the doctor's own cure is what sent you to the asylum. In the 19th century, you could be prescribed mercury, arsenic, or opium for a simple cough. And when those toxic chemicals inevitably made you hallucinate or act weird, they locked you up. They literally poisoned you with their expert remedies and then blamed your brain for reacting to the poison. It is a hilarious circle of stupidity where you go to the doctor for a cold, he gives you a bottle of heavy metals, you go crazy from the side effects, and then he commits you to the asylum for being crazy. You were infinitely safer just staying home and suffering in silence than letting any medical professional near you. 26. Fighting fire sounds like the act of a hero, but in the 19th century, it was a direct path to being labeled a lunatic. If a barn caught fire and you spent a few hours heroically throwing water buckets to save the day, the doctors would reward your bravery with a straitjacket. They genuinely believed that the intense heat of the flames combined with the adrenaline of the moment would boil the fluids in your brain and leave you permanently damaged. It is absolutely hysterical that you could save an entire village from burning down, and your neighbors would thank you by dragging you to the asylum because you looked a little too sweaty and excited afterwards. The medical logic was that no human mind could witness a big fire without snapping, so being a fireman was basically considered a pre-existing mental condition that required immediate lockup. 27. Deranged by a lawsuit was a very real and very common diagnosis that proves the legal system has always been a nightmare. If you were involved in a court case over a property line or a stolen cow and you got a little too stressed about the verdict, they didn't get you a lawyer, they got you a padded cell. The doctors decided that the anxiety of waiting for a judge's decision was too much for the average brain to handle. It is the most ironic double whammy in history because you would lose your money in court, and then the state would take away your freedom because you were upset about losing your money. You practically had to sit in the courtroom with a blank smile while they took everything you owned, just to prove you were sane enough to walk out the door. 28. Nostalgia might sound like a sweet feeling you get when looking at old photos, but back then, it was a serious medical emergency called homesickness that got you institutionalized. If a young man moved away from his parents' farm to the city and started missing his mom's cooking too much, he was considered mentally diseased. Doctors believed that intense longing for home caused the brain to rot from the inside out. It is mind-blowing that they treated a normal human emotion like a deadly virus. Instead of telling the guy to visit his family for the weekend, they locked him in a cold asylum hundreds of miles away from the home he was missing, which is honestly the worst possible cure for homesickness anyone could ever invent. 29. Parents. We're cousins is a diagnosis that appears in the ledgers, and it is just spectacular because it assumes you are crazy based purely on your family tree. If the doctors found out your mom and dad were related, which was actually pretty common in small villages back then, they didn't even wait for you to act weird. They just assumed your blood was corrupted and your brain was doomed to fail. You could be the smartest, most normal person in town, but if someone whispered about your lineage, you were shipped off to the asylum as a preventative measure. It is the ultimate genetic prejudice where you were sentenced to life imprisonment, not for anything you did, but because your grandmother didn't look far enough for a husband. 30. Suppressed itch is hands down the dumbest medical theory in the history of mankind, and it got people locked up for years. The doctors believed that if you had a skin rash or an itch, and you cured it too quickly with ointment, the disease didn't leave your body. It just traveled inward to your brain. So, if a guy stopped scratching his arm, the medical experts concluded that the itchiness had migrated to his mind and made him insane. It is absolutely baffling stupidity. You could be totally fine, but because you used some lotion to fix dry skin, they declared you a lunatic. They literally thought that sanity was just a matter of keeping your skin disease on the outside, and curing it was a dangerous mistake that required psychiatric prison. 31. Change of life is the polite Victorian way of saying that hitting menopause was a crime punishable by imprisonment in a state asylum. If a woman reached a certain age and started feeling hot flashes or mood swings, the medical establishment didn't offer her a fan or a glass of water, they offered her a straitjacket. The male doctors of the time were absolutely convinced that when a woman's biological clock changed gears, her brain would inevitably melt down into total chaos. It is hilarious and terrifying that the natural process of aging was treated like a sudden explosion of insanity. You could be a grandmother who just wanted to knit in peace, but because you got a little irritable about the heat, they locked you up with the raving lunatics. It proves that in the 19th century, simply existing as a female human being over the age of 40 was considered a diagnosable mental health emergency. 32. Religious skepticism was a trapdoor to the asylum that proves you had to walk a very thin line to stay free in the 1800s. We already know that loving God too much was considered crazy. But guess what? Not loving him enough was also a one-way ticket to the padded room. If you asked too many questions during Sunday school or dared to suggest that maybe the miracles were just metaphors, the doctor would scribble "skepticism" on your chart and haul you away. It is the ultimate double standard where you were required to believe exactly the right amount, not too much and not too little. They essentially criminalized critical thinking, deciding that anyone who used their brain to question the local preacher must have a loose screw that needed tightening behind the high walls of an institution. 33. Bad temper appears in the admission books, and it is spectacular news for anyone who has ever woken up on the wrong side of the bed. If you slammed a door because you were angry or shouted at your neighbor for stealing your newspaper, the doctor could classify your anger as a permanent mental defect. They didn't see it as you just having a bad day. They saw it as a derangement of the will that required isolation from society. It is absolutely wild to think that being grumpy was treated as a medical crisis. You could be the most reliable worker in town, but one outburst of frustration at a stubborn mule, and suddenly you are legally certified as insane. It seems the only way to avoid the asylum back then was to walk around with a fake smile plastered on your face 24 hours a day. 34. Exposure to cold was the chilly opposite of sunstroke, and it is just as scientifically ridiculous as every other theory they had. The doctors believed that if you spent too much time out in the snow without a hat, the frost would penetrate your skull and freeze your brain into a solid block of insanity. Instead of giving you a warm blanket and some hot soup to warm you up, they declared that the cold air had permanently shattered your mind. It is baffling stupidity that they treated hypothermia like a personality disorder. You could go out to chop wood, come back shivering, and end up in a cell for 5 years because the medical genius in charge thought your brain had turned into an icicle. It really makes you wonder how anyone in the northern states managed to stay free during the winter months. 35. The wandering uterus is technically known as suppressed menstruation, but the logic behind it is pure fantasy. Victorian doctors actually believed that a woman's uterus was an independent animal living inside her body that could get bored and wander around. They thought if a woman missed her cycle, the organ would float up to her throat or brain and cause immediate insanity. It is the most hilarious anatomical mistake in history. Instead of assuming she was stressed or pregnant, they locked her in an asylum to stop her internal organs from taking a walk. It proves that for a long time, medical science was just men guessing wildly about how women worked. 36. Congestion of the brain sounds like you need a nasal spray, but it was actually a life sentence in the asylum system. Doctors believe that just like your nose gets blocked during a cold, your brain could get blocked up with too much blood if you thought too hard. It is a hilarious mechanical theory where they viewed the human head like a clogged plumbing pipe. If a person seemed confused or had a headache, the medical expert didn't give them aspirin. He signed a paper declaring that their brain traffic was jammed and sent them to prison. It is absolutely wild that a simple headache was treated as a structural failure of the mind that required immediate isolation from society to prevent the head from exploding. 37. Hereditary predisposition is the ultimate form of being guilty until proven innocent. You didn't even have to do anything crazy to get locked up. You just needed a weird uncle or a grandmother who talked to her cats. The doctors would look at your family tree, see one questionable relative, and decide that your brain was a ticking time bomb waiting to go off. It is the most unfair diagnosis in history because they were essentially punishing you for your genetics. You could be the most normal, boring person in the village, but because your dad was a bit eccentric, the state decided to lock you up preemptively just in case you decided to follow in his footsteps later. 38. Desertion by husband is a diagnosis that turns victim blaming into a professional sport. If a man ran off with the milkmaid and left his wife alone, the medical community didn't comfort the poor woman. They declared her insane. The logic was that the shock of being dumped was too traumatic for the female brain to handle, or worse, that she must have been crazy to make him leave in the first place. It is absolutely infuriating and hilarious that a woman could lose her marriage and her freedom on the exact same day. Instead of getting alimony or a divorce lawyer, she got a roommate who thought she was Napoleon, all because her husband was a jerk. 39. The shape of the skull was the basis of a pseudoscience called phrenology, which sent thousands of innocent people to the asylum. Doctors would literally measure your head with a ruler, and if they decided your forehead was too low or your skull had a bump in the wrong place, they declared you a criminal or a lunatic. It is the most laughable attempt at science in history. You didn't even have to act crazy. You just needed a head that didn't fit the doctor's favorite hat size. It is terrifying to think that your freedom depended entirely on whether a guy with a tape measure liked the geometry of your cranium. 40. False confinement was not technically a diagnosis, but it happened so often it deserves a spot here. This was the horrific practice where sane women were locked up by their husbands just because they were annoying or rich. If a man wanted to marry his mistress or steal his wife's inheritance, he simply paid a corrupt doctor to sign the asylum papers. There were no trials and no questions asked. It highlights the absolute lack of rights women had, where being an inconvenient wife was functionally the same as being a dangerous maniac. It wasn't medicine, it was kidnapping with a prescription pad. 41. Spinal irritation is another example of how physical pain was totally misunderstood and criminalized. If you had a bad back from working in the fields or a slipped disc, the doctors claimed the irritation was traveling up your spinal cord and attacking your brainstem. It is the most backward medical logic imaginable because they were punishing people for being in pain. Instead of a massage or a comfortable chair, you got a diagnosis of insanity. You literally had to pretend your back felt great just to avoid being accused of having a softening of the brain caused by your aching vertebrae. It makes you realize that complaining about pain in the 1800s was a dangerous game. 42. Smallpox is a terrifying disease, but surviving it was apparently just as dangerous for your freedom. Doctors often admitted patients who had recovered from the pox because they believed the fever had cooked their brains. Even if you were totally fine after the sickness, the scars on your face were seen as outward signs of internal damage. It is mind-blowing that you could survive a deadly plague only to be thrown in the madhouse as a reward. They basically decided that anyone strong enough to live through the fever must be mentally broken, proving that the medical system was determined to get you one way or another, whether you were sick or healthy. 43. Imaginary female trouble is the most condescending diagnosis ever written down by a male doctor. If a woman complained of pain or sickness that the doctor couldn't see or didn't understand, he simply decided she was hallucinating the whole thing. Instead of admitting he was a bad doctor, he labeled her crazy for thinking she was sick. It is the ultimate gaslighting maneuver where a woman's physical suffering was dismissed as a figment of her imagination that required psychiatric confinement. She would be locked up for years simply because a man with a medical degree was too arrogant to admit that he didn't know what was wrong with her. 44. Unknown is the final and absolute dumbest reason on the entire list, because the doctor literally admitted he had no idea. You see unknown listed as the cause for admission on thousands of records, which means they locked you up without even bothering to invent a fake reason. The doctor just looked at you, shrugged his shoulders and said, "I don't know what's wrong with him, but let's put him in the cage anyway." It is the peak of 19th century absurdity where you didn't even need a diagnosis to lose your freedom. You were just the victim of a shrug and a guess, proving that the entire asylum system was basically a giant guessing game where the prize was a lifetime of gruel and misery. Now here's the real question. Looking at this list, what reason do you think we missed that absolutely should have been here? Not hypothetically, something you know would have gotten people locked up back then. Drop it in the comments and watch the arguments explode. If this made you uneasy, hit like. If you want more truths history tried to bury, subscribe.